the support and prevention outreach activities for women and children who are exposed to domestic violence, as well as the men who abuse them. Discovered this work through the initial work of Dr. Diane Thibodeau in 1986. I came some years later, but my background is in advocacy and the work around clinical direction for people in trauma.
Thank you. My name is Saran Cryer. Harriet Tubman is the place that I work. I am a mental health therapist, and I work with children and their families who have experienced or witnessed domestic violence. Many times children have witnessed domestic violence. And I work with them to help with their mind, body, and spirit. So I use a focus of mindfulness to help women to understand their bodies and what they're feeling, and to understand their trauma. Also to understand how domestic violence could have started in their childhood. So I do a genogram diaphragm to help them to understand their family lifestyle from a child up. So domestic violence becomes more of a symptom of quite a bit of other traumas that people have experienced. But the goal is to eliminate violence in the next generation.
Thank you. My name is Manu Lewis. I actually currently work at North Point Health and Wellness. For the first 2 years I was working at North Point, I was working with co-parent court program, which actually works with parents who have never been married and giving them the tools that they need to communicate and cooperate a little better so the children can have a better future. And along with that, I took a lot of training because I realized that trauma was interwoven, that a lot of individuals that we service was actually dripping in trauma. So took a lot of courses with trauma, and I realized that a lot of the dysfunctional activities in which I found ourselves engaging in has historical background. So it was important for me to go back, to move forward, and actually, especially working with young men, to give them a better perspective on what our roles are in the family.
Thank you. My name is Jamia Bolin Johnson. I am a survivor of domestic violence. I also have a women's ministry that caters to hurting women called Inspiring Minds here in Minneapolis. I am also a director of a nonprofit organization called the Destiny Center, where we serve broken families and we serve individuals who have been pushed out of the home due to violence. And so I'm also an author and editor. I have written a couple of books on my life and how I survived domestic violence.
How do we identify and address generational trauma? Because you talk about trauma a lot. You know, you got the generational, one person, next level, next, you know, we keep going on with it. And how is that behavior learned?
Speaking of generational trauma, how is it passed on, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So from my understanding of generational trauma, I had to go back into history, our history, and what type of people were we when we were brought here? What type of cultures did we have as individuals? How do we treat each other even in those type of situations? So that's a cultural, it has a cultural standpoint to it, and with that cultural standpoint, I realized that the generational trauma comes in when we feed into the conditions in which we were subjected to, right? And that goes back to the slave days and all the conditions which not only was practiced, but they was instituted, right? And you know, and I watch Roots. I have the DVD, the 30th year anniversary, and I often watch it and watch how the treatment of the man in the family setting was traumatizing to the family, and the treatment of the woman in the family setting was traumatizing to the family. So with that, that was the start of the generational trauma, which the children seen, which eventually broke up the families and made us not see each other as one and the same. We lost a lot of respect, and those conditions was passed down. We either seen it or heard it or was exposed to it, or it was taught to us through institutions that it was a proper way that we should conduct or we should treat ourselves or treat each other. And you know, through all these systems, I've noticed that generationally, none of them have really inspired us to be a unit, a family unit. So when we talk about the generational trauma, the things that our foreparents went through, they never got healing, and you know, they never healed from that and was told to continue to move on. So generationally, it just gets passed down without the healing or even bringing notice to it.
Well, I think one of the things about that, you know, with that being said, Manu, is that we want to hide everything. We want to put everything under the rug, and we don't want to deal with it, and we don't want everybody to know. So that's probably how it continues to carry on.
Can I say this? First and foremost, this, with all due respect, I'm a man. I want to apologize, right, for a lot of things that we have done, not knowing exactly how it was gonna roll downhill, right? I consider it a learned behavior, how we treat each other, and I do believe that we can learn something different. But as a man, I realize how much we have broken our women down. So I want to apologize, not for all men, because some of them have to apologize for their own selves. But to start the healing process, you know, we have to start with recognizing what we have done. So I wanted to start off with that, but yeah, I want to clean my face off.
No, you're okay, baby. You're okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Well, go ahead and pick it up, Saran, because you know you're next. You're sitting right there next to him. How you doing, babe? So how do you help victims get their power/voices back when they come to the Tubman Center?
One of the things that I do, is it on?
Yes.
One of the things that I do, I sit with the women and we talk about their lifestyle. And we talk about how trauma and pain sits in our body. And I talk about being healthy, like putting aside the perpetrator or the abuser of the trauma and to center on her and her children and her needs and her wants. So one of the things I help women to understand is the mind is very, very important. It's extremely important because emotions and behavior flows through it. So what you think, you become. So we talk about being healthy in our spirit and being mindful in the moment of what's happening with her and being mindful of some of the things that has happened to her in the past, the generational trauma, the intergenerational trauma. And it starts in the family. So it's to help her to understand what's going on with her. How does she come to where she's at now? Because you have to understand things about you before you could move on in a good way, in a positive way, in a free way. So we talk about the trauma in our families and the patterns. So the patterns with, it could be mental health, it could be physical health as far as domestic violence, it could be anything that's happening. A good example is, well, we had favoritism in our family, and I wasn't the one who was favored. And how does that child grow up? So when a person could put themselves in that place, like identify our own trauma, you know, that hurt me, and I think about that often. And there's a need around it, an emotional need around that could start a pattern of domestic violence in relationships. So what we look at are the patterns and how to break the patterns so they don't interfere with their children, the next generation. And that's the goal of therapy that we discuss and have with me in my sessions, is the next generation is the most important. What has mom learned in domestic violence relationships that she can help her sons and daughters not to experience in their lives.
That was a great segue. I was hoping that the mic would come to me, actually. One thing that I had to learn, I had to learn how to forgive, first of all. I had to realize that it was going to be an inner working of me being renewed. And so I had to learn how to forgive because I was angry. And so everything that I did came out of anger. And I realized that I was very destructive. And so everything that I was doing when I came out of that marriage, I realized that it was going to affect my kids. So what I had to do, I had to sit myself down and say, okay, how can I stop this from being a generational thing? And the way that I started this book off is a scene from when I was a child. I woke up in the middle of the night and I heard my mother screaming. And she had a knife to her neck. She was with my stepfather. She had a knife to her neck, and all I could do was say, okay, what do I do at this moment? And that scene played in my head as I took a look at my children. I said, you know what, I can't have this happen. So what I did was, I went and got help. I went and got help from, professionals, and I also went to church and, the spiritual healing, the mental healing, and I had to be courageous. I had to fight for my peace. I had to fight for my children. I had to fight generationally. So all those things work together. And so what I did was I started to love again through forgiving him for the abuse. When I forgave him, I was free from being angry. I was free from the destructive behavior. I had to understand who I was. And so once I forgave him, that opened up a door for me and my children. And I was able to love correctly because I forgave. And I started to teach my children about signs of abuse, signs of a person who wants to control everything that you do. And I also realized that a lot of broken men are out here walking around and they're not addressing the issues that they have. And so I had to forgive him, and I had to also look at him and say, you know what, he's broken. Here is something that you can go and get help with also. Whether you take it or not, here is somewhere you can go and get help. So I forgave, first of all. I went and got help, and I started to love myself and love my children and teach them the signs of control and abusive behavior.
How do you identify domestic abuse? So it's a perfect segue into your part.
Awesome. I love, too, my partner here, Sister Saran, is saying how the therapeutic niche is there, but many times we think about therapy as being on a professional side, but you just laterally, in your relationships, are giving each other an open window to healing with things like praise, acceptance, and approval. No one of us doesn't need praise, approval, and acceptance. Every male, every female, every other, even your cats and dogs need it. Think about that. So when you think about the lateral, who's next to me, who's, if you're in a big family, like I'm from a big family, there's people who you kind of learn things from just coincidentally, just by the same, I call it the nest that you're in. But when you are trying to notice things that you are missing, start with those three things. Am I getting out of this relationship praise that I need, approval that I need, and acceptance that I need, that I don't have to ask for it and I don't have to perform for it? Think about that. If I have to perform for it, then that means it isn't given to me. It isn't gifted to me as something I need as a human, just a human being. But when I'm working so hard to be accepted, to be praised, and to be approved, and then I get knocked back in my spirit and my mind, my emotions, and even in my body, I'm made the object of dirty jokes. I'm told that I should lose weight, but you give me a box of those Whitman samplers, the 5-pound box one. You know, the big one, and you tell the people, hey, look at her, she needs to lose weight. Hey, baby, I love you.
Right.
Now, which of the 3 things did you not hear I got? I had no acceptance, no praise, no approval. So some of the little things, the way we kind of communicate with each other on ways that we aren't really even saying, like withdrawing affection doesn't mean that somebody isn't kissing all over my face. It just might mean that you spent 4 hours in the salon, male or female. You spent a lot of money in those 4 hours. You came back to your crib. You came back to your relationship, to your lateral, the person who you assume has those 3 things for you. But they withdrew affection, like ignored the fact that you looked different when you came in. You were glowing, and you put a lot of time into this activity, but you didn't get those 3 things. We need to think about how we are abusive to each other. Because setting it up for somebody to perpetuate the idea of brokenness is when those things are missing and we can't even talk about it. How many of you know the finishing of this? Big boys don't, say it again? Cry. How do we know that? We don't accept the fact that a boy, a man, should do what? And thank you for wiping your face, and you should just let the tears run. Because that's so rich and so important and so crucial when you think about breaking a cycle in a, not a generation, but a people group, a family, neighbors, how we have all settled down on, well, I don't need that praise, I don't need that approval, I don't need that acceptance. It's all a lie. Because we are made to receive those things. So my sister here has gone on the opposite end of that tremendously death-defying spectrum, almost to loss of her life. Think about waking up and hearing your mama scream, and it's in your brain, it's in your, all those fancy words about brain science, I could tell it to you, but you have it in the cell base of your brain. You don't have to hear it again outside, it's inside. So think about, if she wants to be approved and praised and accepted, is she learning that the way you get that is you let somebody traumatize you in that way, or you never talk about the trauma, or you live it out in ways that you become subservient in relationships, or I don't mean just in intimate partner relationships, just relationships with coworkers even. The expectation for you is to work 49 hours a week, not 40. Because you're doing everything for everybody to get that praise, that approval, that acceptance, and you are killing yourself. Look at it. So think about the ways in which we are laterally treating each other. Sometimes we're angry when somebody gets a promotion and they're in our field and our peer. But we aren't saying that we're angry. We're just not going to give them the praise, the approval, or the acceptance. We might even be glad if they have a slip and fall. They may not be able to engage their duties that day, because I can jump in, for them. But some of these things we have to think about. We're doing it maybe on a subconscious level, but we're just letting it go. But awareness is curative. If we become aware, we can bring some cure.
Again, it goes back to that praise, approval, acceptance, okay? And going back even further, the generational thing. I lost my father when I was young. I was filling the void, after it, filling the void. And I noticed right away that he was very controlling over my time, how many hours I worked, and we weren't even married yet. And so, as I saw the signs, I ignored them. And I also noticed that he did not like me to be affectionate with my family members. If I hugged my brother or my sister or my mother, he would be angry. And he would stand next to me and kind of assert his strength over me, to try to keep me from being affectionate with family members. This is not some other man, you know, but my own family members. So I noticed right away the controlling behavior he had, and also him trying to assert himself over me, trying to overpower me, even being around family members, and the way he also had he was very emotionally abusive. He would bring me up and tear me down and then bring me back up again. And so I was very, very vulnerable. I was very, very weak. I was blind to the signs as far as me saying, okay, I see that and I'm going to stop it. Goes back to those three things that I was looking for and filling that void. So those signs, I ignored them, and they were very visible. They were so visible that my own mother told me, you need to leave him alone right away because he's dangerous. My own mother. But because I was running after a void, I was trying to fill a void, I was looking for something, I didn't hear anything she had to say. And when he proposed to me, I immediately said yes. Oh, he loves me. He loves me. And the first day we moved in together, the first thing he did in front of me was burn the marriage certificate. And he told me, he set it on fire right in front of me. He told me, he said, this is how the marriage is going to be from this day forward. And at that moment, now check this out. At that moment, and I looked back at that moment, and I was thinking to myself, how in the world did I allow myself to continue to get entangled in this web? Immediately, I said to myself, okay, here we go with this whirlwind of abuse. How did I get here? I ignored the signs. I ignored them. So we cannot ignore those signs of control. You know, when someone is trying to overpower you, you cannot ignore that. You know, and I after a while, I realized he was the weak one. Because if he was confident in himself, a man does not do that to a woman. And so those were the things that I ignored. And those were the signs that I had to say, okay, I need to let people know about these things, how to recognize signs. I needed to tell my daughters about these things, and not to be blinded by those things. And one thing that is very important for a mother to do who has survived domestic violence is to love her children in a way that they won't have to go out there and try to fill a void. I was missing the love factor. I was missing that love factor from within also. And so it was a combination of the generational thing, seeing my mother abused, and it was also me being fatherless, trying to fill a void, and also me searching for something. And that's what it was for me.
How can we hold abusers accountable?
Because if somebody doesn't know that they're being abusive, or if they're just following what was taught to them, if they don't know that they're being abusive, it's hard for them to be held accountable, right? So in my groups, I often use the concept of, because I do most of my facilitation with men, and it's always a beautiful thing to have the men raise their hands who have daughters, right? And start from that point, right? And, you know, and I'm a man, I've always been a man, and I'll probably die a man. And I recognized, you know, what domestic violence means to me, because I was also a survivor of verbal abuse every day, right? Because my stepfather had a low education. He had a high propensity for vulgarity, right? I knew all the cuss words. 5, 6 years old, I could rattle them off. But it wasn't later until I understood that that was verbal abuse. Never raised his hand at my mama, never raised his voice. But there was a jazz festival of cuss words all the time. So, you know, I kind of understood why my mom had this thirst for me to read, right? Read books, read, and I understood that she would test me on what does this word mean, what does that word mean, but what she wanted me to do was build my vocabulary. So I wouldn't have so many cuss words so I could, you know, interchange them with something jazzy to the ears. And I have a daughter, right? My daughter's 16 years old. I love my daughter, but I understand that my daughter grows up in a different world. So I communicate with my daughter. I talk to my daughter. I get real verbal with my daughter. And, you know, she said, "Daddy, you talk too much." But she doesn't hear a cuss word. She hears so many other beautiful shaded words that we have to go off into the lexicon or go grab the thesaurus right quick, right? So I realized what I had been through, and even though I thought that when I was verbally abusive to somebody else, the reaction that I got, I thought that was powerful. But I realized that it was powerless. I was giving all my power away. So what I had to do is recognize where I had been traumatized, how it made me feel, what I felt even when I reciprocated that or pushed my resentments or anger off on somebody else and went to those abusive lifestyles. It was important for me to realize how that made other people feel because it made me feel the same way. So when I communicated with my daughter and even to these men that I work with, you know, it's a thing of putting your shoes in somebody else's feet, right? And especially with the men, majority of us came through the canals of a woman, right? And the ones who have daughters, like, yeah, you got a sister, right? How would you like for somebody to treat your sister, your mama, your daughter like that? And a lot of things change, especially when we're in the company of men, when it's all men, right? We have a way of communicating in a different fashion when there's women around. So I like the company of men because we get to hold each other accountable, right? And for the individuals who know, I can't tell another man what you have done. You know what you have done. Right, so when we can identify how that's dysfunctional, especially working with parents, and a lot of our men feel as though just because they have had a child by a woman that they know her, without even having a conversation of what she has gone through to get to this point, right? So when we skip over that courting date and trying to get to know someone and we just, you know, get engaged or get physical, and we skip over some of those steps, we didn't get to know a person, so we may not know what their trauma is or what their history is, to be able to recognize them through their light, to be able not to re-traumatize them, right? So that's the importance of, and in my groups, having those conversations that don't have no end to them.